UPG is a term I find to be often misunderstood. Short for unverified personal gnosis, this phrase is sometimes wielded as a criticism in the world of spirituality, pagan, polytheist, or otherwise. It's the word unverified that stands out in this instance, that seems to be contextualizing someone's personal gnosis about a spiritual path or being or myth as dubious or heterodox. When used disparagingly, UPG can feel like a corrective. In many ways, it can feel like a tool within so-called alternative spirituality to reinforce the kind of strictures of the culturally dominant monotheisms onto the old gods, whether they like it or not. In the Protestant form of Christianity that I grew up with, the Word of God had already been written down in the Old Testament and the New Testament, and that was the Almighty's mic drop. Any divine addendums beyond it were generally considered heresy. When the stakes of divinely inspired words can bear the punitive power conferred by the Christian Bible, it's easy to see why the amendment process would be extremely bureaucratic. It's this very patriarchal approach to spirituality that we find in monotheism, though, that makes alternative spirituality so appealing in the first place. What if UPG is a feature of spirituality, not a bug? What if idiosyncratic personal gnosis from a god or spirit is a sign that you're having an authentic interaction as opposed to adopting a state-mandated morality tale? What if the gods and their stories are alive and not frozen in amber? When Briar writes about the gods, they feel alive. They have new things to teach and to convey, and the forms they can take are not limited to our preconceived notions. When we hear the word polytheist, I think we can sometimes think of someone with a religious practice similar in philosophy to monotheism, where the God in question is an all-powerful and omnipotent authority to be obeyed, only with a lot more gods to contend with. From this vantage, a goddess of spring or a god of the sea can seem like a goddess ruling over spring or a god ruling over the sea. In actual practice, I think the relationship is a lot more fluid and experiential. Pantheons, I think, are not actually so codified. They are beings to be co-created with, in flux and in dialogue. Briar's polytheist practice takes the form of what she likes to call the Home Cultus, where the gods are shaped by the land and alive in the home, imparting gnosis with no verification required. Not frozen in amber, but in active participation. On today's episode, Briar breaks down the anatomy of a home cultus and invites you to cultivate your own. Briar, welcome back to Radical L-Fam for the 2-year anniversary. It's awesome to have you here.
Yes, thank you for having me back. It's like the yearly rendezvous, it seems. So thanks, much appreciated. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, I'm really excited. Now this is the third time having you on. And it's great to just check in. And, in the intervening year, I'm always following the stuff you're putting out, great articles and essays. And this year, we were talking about some things that maybe would be interesting to discuss. And I think there's a few really cool pieces to talk about. One that really jumped out to me was this piece that's coming out soon in a newer zine called The Holy Mountain. And it's a piece on the Home Cultus, which is a term I've never actually quite heard. And the way you describe it is fascinating and touches on a lot of subjects I'm very interested in. So I think we'll talk a lot about that piece today.
That's okay.
And part of what I really loved in it is you talking so much about your Alpine homeland, which is the French Alabrosian region. It just became very alive and vivid while reading it. And to kick things off, before we even dive into that piece, I wanted to ask you if you feel like the country of France, as we call it now, is overlooked when we think of, Celtic mythology and folklore.
Yes, very much so. So, oh my God, thank you for giving me a platform to voice that.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I do feel that actually. I think France is often overlooked as a Celtic land, and mainly I think that's largely because Roman conquest and then later Christianization, and they were so successful that they sort of rewrote the story. Um, Gaul is remembered as something that was subdued mostly by Roman imperialism, rather than the cradle of continental Celtic culture in its own right. And in France, we still speak the colonizers' language. We are a Latin language. About 80% of our words come from Latin. So that alone tells you how deep that sort of erasure runs. So what gets lost is that I think much of what we now call Celtic didn't really necessarily begin on the islands, or at least there is like a scholarly consensus on that. There is a very real possibility that it traveled from inland Europe. So the Alps, those valleys, the mountains stretching through modern France, Switzerland, Austria, all those places gave us like some very rich archaeological evidence of Celtic civilization. And I don't want to make an indistinction between France and Gaul, because the boundaries of Gaul were not exactly the boundaries of France. So there is a bit of leeway here. It extended into Germany, Belgium, some of Switzerland. So it's not exactly equivalent, but most of what was Gaul was indeed France. But anyway, all those places gave us some super rich archaeological evidence, of Celtic civilization. Even the name, like you might have heard of Hallstatt, of Latene, which they really define Proto-Celtic culture coming from the mainland, so continental Celtic territories. And yeah, I believe there is that continuity everywhere you're willing to look. We have shared gods, we have shared names. Brigid, Brigantia, Lugus, Lu, figures like Cernunnos even, who is sort of endlessly appropriated today. Into that horned god figure of fertility, of sexuality, of wilderness, and there is truth to that. Don't get me wrong, but there are other Gaulish roots, about liminality, about a sort of Gaulish Saturnian figure that are completely ignored. So France ends up being this strange Celtic orphan, um, dismissed in favor of the insular nations who preserve languages, who preserve an actual Celtic culture a bit better. But that's despite the evidence that quite literally is still being buried in our soil. So I feel
Mm.
I feel quite passionate about that, and that's why the old way still whisper, or gods were many, or carnixes were loud. So thank you for allowing me to blow, to toot that one today. I really don't think that's an inheritance that disappears just because history decided to look elsewhere. Our temples are long gone, but our gods, our faith, very much remains. And I'm super excited to get to talk about that Gaulish heritage because thanks to this piece for the Holy Mountain and from this interview as well, I get to delve into something that I'm not often asked about, but is very much part of my religious and spiritual life. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, that's really interesting, honestly. I mean, the whole term Celtic is such a
Yeah, it's a
kind of
hodgepodge.
vague, strange concept that I think people think they have an idea about, but when you dive into it, it really only describes something very broad, and loses so much nuance. So I
Therefore,
appreciate that insight. That's super fascinating, honestly. Um, you mentioned it there, the Holy Mountain, this new zine, something that I honestly wasn't that familiar with until you brought this article to my attention. So I'd love if you could describe maybe how you got connected with this project and maybe a bit about it.
yes. Well, I should probably start to say that it's not my project. So all credits where it's due. It's from my friend Hazel, who holds a website called Home Cultus, and you can also find her on Instagram over here. She's a mountain person as well, and I think what she really wanted to do was to bring together some occult thinkers and writers that she liked, as an act of resistance towards that growing fascism that sort of creates myth making for bigoted ends. So there is very much a leftist, a radical desire to be able to communicate on subjects about identity or stuff like that without it being absolutely like co-opted by far right extremism. Especially in today's world, it feels especially important. So she's rounded up the troops and the authors and illustrators and creators and poets and artists that she wants around her for that. And I've been kindly invited to contribute a piece, so it's still very much ongoing. So I won't say much more because I don't think I have a right to. It's her project, but yeah, just watch this space. I think it's going to be interesting.
Yeah, I'm very excited to check it out. I'll definitely have her on if she's interested when it comes out. That'd be fun to hear more about what inspired it and stuff. So yeah.
Defo, defo.
Cool. I love it. Well, diving into this piece, it's called Keeping Peace with the Neighbors. I would love it if you could just start by describing this concept you present, this home cultus. How would you describe the home cultus?
Sure, yeah. So for me, a home cultus is that small, repeated ritual life of a given household. It places the hearth at the center. And so it's important, I say, it's not about, reconstructing a pantheon or public religions. It's just more about the way a home, a household situates itself in relationship to its lands, to its neighbors, neighbors humans and other than humans. And so it's made of very modest things, modest gestures like small offerings, like words and runes spoken at thresholds, care for water, for fire, for food, for healing, for wholeness. It's just, it isn't about the spectacle or the completeness, but about the attention, about the presence. I think a home cultus, the way I describe it in the piece, is very much partial by nature, because it's shaped by what survived as much as by what was lost, and in between that, what is still felt. So it's a way of keeping peace, hence the title, with the neighbors, the spirits of place, with the dead, with the gods who stayed close enough in the land, in the soil to be remembered.
I love that. That's beautiful. Yeah, I really appreciate I really appreciate this concept because I feel like sometimes, especially from the outside, if you are somebody hearing about polytheism, you kind of think you're just replacing a single monotheistic god with a couple others and
Hmm.
like doing more or less the same type of thing. But the way you describe the home cultist to me is a lot more what it's really like practicing some of these more polytheistic type of beliefs in the modern world, where you're more making relationships with certain things that might be deities, but also the land and also the environment. And it starts to kind of become something like super idiosyncratic. It's no longer something that everybody who's a Celtic polytheist does this. It's about kind of your own experience. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah, it does. It does. And that's very much what it is. It's personal at the end of the day, even though it can be built, on an actual pantheon and on evidence, which is what I describe in the piece to sort of give. Because the idea is that although I talk from a specific Gaulish background, I do believe that the methodology behind it is transferable. Um,
Yeah.
and importantly, it's transferable even to people who might be interested, people from diaspora, from immigration and things like that. And it's important that you bring this heritage with you and that you look at the lands you currently stand on and build a home based on all those roots because they all matter in different ways.
I love that. Yeah, there was a quote that really stood out to me that I wanted to read for you, and then get your thoughts on it to expand a bit. It is pre-Roman Gaulish religion did not survive in sacred text or continuous institutions, and what remains are fragments, inscriptions, dedications, place names, archaeological traces. These are almost always mediated through Roman language and categories. But rather than treating these vestiges as distortions to be discarded, I choose to approach them as they are, traces of local religious life that endured long enough to be recorded. I thought this passage captured perfectly the nuance required to engage with the old gods, but also remaining conscientious of the landscape and its spirits, the role of your own ancestry, and the meaning of the events that unfolded from a mythical time when the pantheons of the land you are connected to were clearly defined and living in the wider culture to today when they are not so much. So I'm interested, how do you understand that nuance required in this relationship?
So for me, I think working with fragments isn't a failure of reconstruction, it's the condition of it, you see. So pre-Roman Gaulish religion didn't survive intact, that's true. And pretending otherwise, it does risk, a bit of fantasy or projection. It's an illusion, I think, to look for purity absolutely in any domain, and it's a dangerous one at that. I think I always look at that with a bit of a red flag in my mind. A word of caution is that I'm very much not a purist because I'm a Gallo-Irish polytheist, so you have to take what I'm saying both on Gaulish front and Irish front with a pinch of salt because I am biased. I have my own, religious syncretism that is relevant to me but might not always make sense to others. So, fragments, they are not empty. They are traces of relationships that, as you said, endured long enough to leave a mark. So rather than trying to peel away that Roman mediation to reach some of that imagined purity, I prefer to take the material as it comes. So those inscriptions, those place names, those syncretic forms, I gather them all and I treat them as evidence of a lived religion under pressure, under imperial pressure, but still here, and that demands a bit of distance, a bit of humility and restraint, but also, I think, a willingness to accept to live with some uncertainty. So that relationship with the fragments is always one of dialogue, and it cannot be one of mastery because you have constantly new archaeological evidence emerging, reframing, the way you may have understood things, and that's what makes it so exciting as well. So I can't claim, and I don't want to claim to be resurrecting like sort of the lost world. I just try to listen carefully to what remains for now, and that for now is important, and to let practice emerge from that listening, in a way that's as honest as I can master about ancestry, about displacement, and about the lands, plural, I'm answering to.
Yeah, it's something that kind of came up for me in the last episode I did with Sarah Bonadea George, where we were talking about more or less Freya and how she evolved over the years.
Mm,
And I think there's this impulse that I understand to take like, particularly when we're talking about deity figures, and say like, okay, well, when the Christians came in and conquered everything and the deities could no longer be openly worshipped, they bitterly ran away, because they're pissed. But it's like, I think these deity figures are probably a lot more complex and interesting than that, to where they would probably not see it as below them to adapt and evolve to still stay connected with the land and the people on it, I would imagine, honestly. And to kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater and not see how things syncretized and remained in local customs and these sort of things as connected to some of the older beliefs. Seems like you're missing the point, perhaps.
yes, I do think you are missing things, and in growing in my own religious beliefs, that's something that I'm coming to accept more and more, because there is a lot of me that is resistant towards I want to say Christianity, but maybe it's monotheistic religion as a whole. It's just
Yeah.
that they hold such dominance that there is everything in me that wants to resist to that. But it also come from some of my allies, obviously, who are known to have a strong dislike of the cross in particular, and yet, it's not as clear cut as that, and luckily so. And the bones and the fragments from an old religion can still be preserved and leavened in the new religion. And it's important to be able to see that. And there's a lot about the nature of deity here, of divinity, that as human beings, maybe we don't understand completely fully when the transition like that appears. So what else can you do than trying to hold all of those contradictions together and make sense in a way that works for you, right?
Hell yeah. I think that's great. I think you describe it very well in the piece in a way that I don't often see talked about. So I appreciate that. So, when describing the old spiritual practices in the Alpine region you're from, you said that to its ancient inhabitants, religion was inseparable from geography. Can you describe how this religious experience manifested for the people of the Allobrogian Alps?
Yes. So in the Allobrogian Alps, religion followed the contours of the land, I think is what I'm trying to say here. I called that religion of the lived territory or religion du terroir. And I think terroir is actually a word that you know and that you must
Hmm.
like a lot. It's a bit of an untranslatable French word into English, much like land actually is from English to French, funnily enough. So it comes, I'm not teaching you anything here, but maybe for the people listening to us, terroir comes from eunology semantics. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. But essentially, it encompasses both that, idea of a complete natural environment in which a particular wine is produced, including factors such as the temperature, the topography, the climate, the soil, all of that, and how that creates flavor and character and taste that is literally imparted to a wine, to the vine, by the environment in which it grows. So, for the purpose of this article, I've chosen to translate religion du terroir into religion of a lived territory because I think it intimately connects to all those everyday practices, those things that are very rooted, that are very grounded, landscapes that are both topographical, but also mythopoetical and all those natural resources. So the Allobroge or Allobroges probably in Latin, they are a mountain people from Sapaudia. Literally, Sapaudia is the root word that gave us Savoy, and it translates as the land of the evergreen trees. And now it's roughly Savoie, Haute-Savoie, part of Isère, Dauphiné, Ain, but also Switzerland and some of northern Italy as well, because the boundaries, the borders, they weren't exactly as they are today. So it wasn't a religion that was organized around monumental temples or, abstract theology, or there was no civic goal or authority like the Roman religion was, for instance. It was very much about keeping peace with the neighbors. It was around those movements, those dangers, those survival, because the mountains are a difficult terrain to live in. They are a beautiful landscape, but they are also quite unforgivable. You've got passes, you've got rivers, you've got lakes, springs, forests, and they aren't just scenery or backdrop for a religion. They are actually agents, especially from an animist perspective. So all gods were our neighbors. They were tied to specific places, to specific needs. You find healing waters, you find safe travel, you find protection of households, you find the maintenance of balance as a whole or right relationships. So there is a strong argument in this religion that the name of all gods, of the Gaulish gods as we understand them, were actually epithets or euphemism to respect a taboo of pronouncing the name of the gods one swears by. And if we
Hmm.
go deeper here, I think we circle back to some very real prescriptions of fairy folklore, right? Which
Hmm.
is really, really interesting because that's uniquely Gaulish and uniquely interesting in that regards as it relates to fairy lore. So our sanctuaries were super modest, super rural. They were meant for repeated use rather than ostentatious display. And attention matters because, well, because the land could kill or heal you. So you had to stay alert. It was about right relationship. You know that quote from Terry Pratchett about not believing in the postman?
Hmm.
I think there is a bit of that here. You did not believe in the postman. You were believing in knowing where you were, who you were dealing with, and how to move through those relationships and through the world without provoking harm or drawing harm to yourself. So strikingly, it's a region of Gaul that really preserved its indigenous divinities, and there was a very strong resistance to imperial cultus. And it's clear from the evidence we retrieve that the imperial religion of the Roman did not really implant itself super well, or rather, it did so, for instance, under strict conditions. So one example off the top of my head is you find inscriptions dedicated to Castor and Pollux, the swan twins, and in a lacustrine region, where swan is a native species. This obviously makes a lot of sense because all of a sudden, swan being that sort of fairy liminal animal bridging water, land, and sky, it tells you
Mhm.
that natural fauna and flora would dictate whose gods could come and whose gods could stay because they made sense.
Yeah, the terroir term I think is always really useful in many subjects outside of wine. I do love it in the magical context. And it's interesting because, not to get too into wine, I have another podcast for that, but there's a large part of like the movement I've been a part of in the wine world is a movement away from homogeneity.
Mm.
Not trying to just go like, well, here in California, we sell mainly Pinot Noir and Cabernet Sauvignon and Chardonnay. So we're going to just only plant this like monocultural approach to what is available and not take risks on more interesting varietals or more like interesting winemaking styles. It's this very homogenous perspective. And people like me have kind of tried to actually been towards terroir, trying to find more unusual varietals suited to very niche places to
I like
hopefully
that.
produce wines that are more complex and more interesting and more meaningful. And it's funny because that was something I was drawn to before I even really went down the path of localized spirituality. So it's interesting how much you saying that shows how my life is dovetailed in this like very obvious way that I didn't really consider. But that leads
You're a
to my next
one-trick
question.
monkey.
I know, honestly, that leads to my next question, which is taking all of that into consideration. What do you think the divorce of geography and landscape from the dominant religions of the contemporary West, in quotes, has done to the spiritual lives of the people living in that culture?
My God, you're giving me a lot of authority here, but I'm not sure I
It's your
have.
personal take. It's your personal take.
Okay, okay. With that caveat, okay. I think I think it's I think it's produced some kind of spiritual homelessness. When religion detaches itself from the land, it becomes more abstract. It becomes more portable and more universal to an extent, and that can be positive, but also I think it risks become more disembodied, and everything relating to the body then generates fear or shame, or at the very least defiance. So that's something I feel that we see in monotheism as a whole, for instance. um, so people are taught what to believe, but not necessarily where they are. And then we struggle to put the divine back into immanence, into the daily. We think it needs to be necessary, spectacular, and revolutionary, and, an epiphany of every day. But epiphanies can be really simple, small, beautiful things. And that loss shows up as, I think, in the West, a lot of anxiety and disorientation and a hunger for meaning that often gets sadly projected onto identity or ideology instead of place. And here I'm circling back to some of the ethos that we want to convey with the holy mountain. But when we lack that ritual context, that ritual framework to understand our spiritual cravings or longings, as a result, as a society, we constantly downplay them or we mock them. And it becomes harder to communicate about them here because they are, again, disembodied. They are not part of the daily anymore. So without rituals that sort of answer to or respond to the landscape, to the seasons, to those local spirits, spirituality becomes something you risk to just consume rather than something you can embody or practice in relationship. And I want to really insist on the word relationship because I think it's super crucial. We've done in the West, we've done ourselves a big disservice by distinguishing between, the body and spirit. From an animism perspective, this makes no sense at all. It really does not make sense. So that's why I think home cultus is a way to re-anchor that faith. It reminds us that spirituality begins right here under your feet, not necessarily above your head.
That's super well said. You describe your approach to building a home cultus as manifesting from several overlapping categories that are in dialogue. I'd love it if we could touch on each of those a little bit. So, first, you mentioned the category of, quote, deities whose names are clearly indigenous, even written in Latin, end quotes. What is their role in building a home cultus? And can you give us an example of one from the Allobrogian region?
Yes, so indigenous deities are the backbone of a home cultus because it will anchor the cultus in place. Even when their names survive only in Latin inscriptions, the functions of those gods and spirits are local and intimate. For instance, in the Sapaudia region, we've got Borvo or Borwo, and it's a name that is inseparable from the thermal waters of a region because it literally means to heat or to boil, and so it speaks of boiling water, of fire in water, which is so crucially important in Celtic spirituality as a whole and that we find everywhere. So already here, from the very local, you are tying up to some, I want to say Celtic, but really it's Indo-European motif of fire in water, of fire in every water that is so important. So in those function of healing, of purifications, of bodily care, you find the gods. I can think about the matrae or the materes, the matres, the matronae, in Latin the dominae, the mothers, which are or the ladies. Interesting. So, which are really truly fascinating deities. They are like triads and fate figures tied to fairy beings, even down to their very names. And from the French fay, from the Latin fatum, meaning destiny. So in a home cultus, the worship of such figure isn't just about recreating public ceremonies or sanctuaries, but more about translating those presence into daily acts, circling back to Borwo, water, cleanliness, tending the body. You might just locate his cultus into your bathroom and it would make just complete sense. These gods remind us that religion begins with our lived needs. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting the way you put that, how some of these names seem to almost be like epithets and how that really ties the landscape into the deity itself,
Mhm.
which definitely gives it that sense of place, which that's very fascinating. I love that, as opposed to just like, well, this is the god of spring, it's more specific.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. Definitely. And at the same time, it is the god of that particular spring. So it's very localized and very
Hmm.
situated, but not so much. He's the
Yeah.
boiling one. So,
Yeah.
from a Celtic perspective, you can't ignore just all the threads that you might pull from that one.
That's super interesting. I love that. So next you describe the category of, quote, deities appearing through syncretism. So can you expand on their role as well as give us an example from the Allobrogian region?
Sure, yes. I think syncretic figures will show up pretty consistently across the Gaulish territory. And, they always signal continuity rather than replacement, simply because Roman names often they function a bit like masks for local gods whose roles remained intact but were reframed into a Latin Roman understanding, the notion of interpretatio romana, which is both a blessing and a bane because the Gaulish people did not commit their belief through writing. So a lot of what we know about our gods was preserved from the invaders' perspective. And so obviously you can't ignore those sources, but you have to study them with caution. And so one god that is super important to the Gaulish pantheon that we know about, because a lot of Roman writers and scholars and thinkers, including Caesar, actually in a military context, flagged as being so crucially important, is gods that they identify to be alike to Mercury. Okay, so Mercury, you will find a lot about him in Gaul, and in particular in the Allobrogian region, is identified with Lugus. Lugus obviously is cognate with Lu, the Irish gods, and he became a god of threshold, of roads, of contracts, of oaths and their keeping, of movements, and of course always skills and art. So exactly what an alpine territory requires, if you might argue about it. Lyon, for instance, in modern France, was known as Lugdunum, so the house of Lugus, quite literally. Those kind of gods, they sort of help the home stay open to exchange without losing that grounding. So syncretic figures are important in the home cultus.
Yeah, yeah, it's kind of like your road opening ally in your home or
Yes,
something like that. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
that's great. So you go on to describe the category of, quote, figures including tentatively inferred through patterns rather than direct attestation and always with caution. So this seems like a juicier ingredient to the home cultist. So I'd love to hear more about it.
Yes, it is a juicer ingredient. Okay, so both figures, they demand a bit of control and restraint here. They are included not necessarily because we are certain that they were worshipped here locally, because quite simply we might not have the vestiges to prove it, but because we might find traditions that echo to those ancient figures quite literally. For instance, in the Alpine region, we have a lot of things around the she-bear and about Ursa Major and around around the Great Bear in the Sky that shows up in the land also. So you might then question, okay, we haven't retrieved anything from attesting the goddess Artio or Artaia or Arteia, but that doesn't mean
Hmm.
she wasn't here. I'm also thinking of other goddesses that were super important. The very obvious one is obviously Epona, um, uh, whose cult was so important actually that a sort of reverse phenomenon happened, and from a Gaulish goddess, she became imported into Rome. Because she was so important and prevalent around Gaul as a whole. So, when you look at your territory and you're like, okay, but she does not appear, but we have horse ceremonies, we've got horse
Mm,
festivals. And so how do you interpret that? How do you contrast that in comparison with that? And I'm also thinking about a goddess that I'm personally very, very attached to, which is Sirona. So those category of deities, they teach you to live with ambiguity and to make space for it, for uncertainty, as also some sort of devotional virtue. It's a different posture, but it is here and it is worth thinking about.
that's fascinating. Yeah, and it gives the gods, if we want to call them that, a chance to maybe go traveling. Maybe they find somebody in a different place who draws them in, and then they make a home there themselves, even if they weren't
Yes.
already there. It's kind of interesting to think of.
Definitely.
Yeah, more co-creative in that sense. So I like that. I've never heard of the goddess Catho until reading this article. I'm curious if you can describe her and how you discovered her. She's very fascinating to me.
Yes, for me too, to be honest. I was absolutely blown away when I discovered this goddess the first time. And I did not understand her. Funnily enough, I tried to connect with her and she never answered until I had an established relationship with the Morrigan, and then she became present. So, I had to go through the Irish to come back to France, to come back to home. And it's an interesting dialogue. But for those people who don't know Cafu Bordua, and I don't blame you because she's very a small, not very well known goddess at all, but she's a fragmentary Gaulish figure, feminine figure, associated with battle, with protection, and with liminal threat, defending your boundaries. And she's known from one single damaged inscription in the region. So her name is reconstructed, and that uncertainty is important because it's a linguistic reconstruction. It posits that the text's restitution on the vestige that we found is Cafu Bordua, and it depends on the assumptions that an initial C has been lost. And we've come to that conclusion because of Irish medieval onomastics, which is why it's so funny to me that I had to go through the Irish to come back to that French, Gaulish goddess. So it's combining, the root word katu, which means combat or battle, with
Mm,
bodua, which means crow. And we think that it means battle crow. So obviously it reminds you of Bavkata, and that root of the Proto-Celtic katu bodua, a word that could literally be interpreted as battle crow or battle fighting. So I didn't really discover her through, any certain means. And as I said, when I first initially tried to establish a cultus or to invite her into my home, she didn't answer. These things happen. I thought she was just not interested. And, we've all experienced that. Sometimes you try to connect with a spirit and you don't feel like there is necessarily an answer, that you're getting something in return. Not that you do it for this reason, but you do need to feel like you're in a relationship somehow. So it was more about resonance, and as someone that's, shaped also by different borders and different difficult terrains, I recognize her as a guardian of limits rather than conquests. And including her in my cultus wasn't a scholarly claim, it was just a personal one as a Gallo-Irish polytheist. And again, she made sense also because I see her connection with the Morrigan.
that's fascinating. I directly kind of going into that a bit, this connection you have with the Morgan, how the Morgan kind of opened her up to you. Um, Definitely accepting that this is more or less just asking for like your theoretical perspective on it, and also just your own personal experience. I'm curious, what is your best understanding of these different cultural manifestations of a very similar being? Do you see them as different names for one being, different beings in a wider ecology of related spirits, or something different?
That's a very hard question. It's always a very tricky one to answer. Okay, well, I'll try to be nuanced.
What's your answer
I,
for today? Let's just like leave it at that.
yes,
Maybe
thank
tomorrow your
you.
mind will change. What's your answer today?
I appreciate that it leaves room for breathing space and for growth and for
Yeah.
error also. So I appreciate the grace here. I don't see them today as the same being with different names. First of all, Bavkata is a face of the Morrigan. So Katfu Bodua as an equivalent would only be also a face of the Morrigan or a broader, war goddess, if we want to posit it like that. The Morrigan is such a complex figure. She encompasses such complex notions, such fundamental notion of Irish spirituality when it relates to prophecy, to fate, to war as a necessity, a lot of things. But definitely, yes, they share functions, when we think protection, when we think sovereignty, when we think the ethics and the pitfalls of conflict, of battle, of war, when we think the crow, all of this, we see that there is an ecological system behind all of that. But Cafu Bodua and the Morrigan, they arise from different landscapes and histories, and I'm a hard polytheist like that. But equally, I do see Cafu Bodua being linked to the Morrigan, and the essence of the gods, the nature of divinity is complex. Maybe they are the same being. I'm a soft polytheist like that for
I love
today.
it. I
So,
love it.
thinking ecologically rather than purely from an identitarian perspective, I think that allows for for kingship, for companionship, without flattening everything or collapsing everything into one. And so we can preserve those differences while still acknowledging a pattern. Syncretism makes sense for me in my own home cultus, but one aspect of holding together those multiple traditions is that you always see the line. You always see the line always. Gaulish beliefs is not the Irish beliefs, and that feels truer to how polytheist worlds would actually work. I cannot be a purist because that's not my history. I'm not just from one territory, but I would never affirm, yes, they are the same being, because it would contradict the lived experience of others and the lived gnosis of others also. So I'm mindful of that.
Very, very good answer. It just occurred to me, and this probably already occurred to you, but you were saying you couldn't contact her until you went through the Morgan, sort of, right?
Yes, yes.
Do you think that's because you are now on the Morrigan's land?
Oh, am I on the Morrigan's land? Because I'm right in the middle of England. Yeah, I guess we can think about how those territories actually, there is a continuum here. I
Yeah.
think Morrigan and I, we have a strange relationship because my mentor, the Morrigan, was her patron goddess, and my mentee is a priestess of the Morrigan. And so she's always sort of been here, and I'm sitting here in the middle between, my my grandmother in my lineage and my grandchild in my lineage, with Bridget in the middle as a sort of link. But I think I must have become interesting to the Morrigan in a way, because she started to reach out very explicitly with a mission, and I think it's very much linked also to that teacher and student aspect also. So I'm just trying to listen.
Interesting. I love that. Thank you for sharing. So kind of switching to a different piece you put out in the past year that I really, really enjoyed. It's on your Green Chapel website, and it's called Grammar of the Marked. I'm
Mm.
wondering if you can describe this piece for the listeners and maybe what inspired you to write it.
Sure, yes. So the grammar of the marked is an article that is freely downloadable on my website, and it's an attempt to sort of name something that people have always recognized, but that we always also struggle to have language for. And that's the simple fact that across cultures and time, some individuals are perceived as having been marked or touched by the other world, or many other worlds, plural. That means altered by contact with spirits, gods, the dead, or other liminal forces. So what inspired me to write this piece was just a recurring question that I kept being asked. It comes up in my monthly Q&As on Instagram. It comes up with students, with clients, with fellow practitioners also. And essentially it's, how do you know? How do traditions recognize that someone is not just spiritually curious? It's like bi-curious, but spiritually claimed in a way. And so I thought about that, and rather than sort of offering a checklist or like a promise of specialness, or fueling into that elected one or chosen one syndrome, I wanted to write about those patterns that appear again and again in various different folklores across the world. And so I delved into, well, occult philosophy, of course, but also anthropology, and I sort of dug out some recurring things like, I don't know, unusual births, or illnesses, or encounters with death, or bodies that are different in one way or another, or strange dreams, affinities with animals or the land, or trauma, pure and simple. All of those aren't guarantee of power, because there is a difference between a mark and a gift, and it's a difference I'm attached to. But definitely there are signs of, well, they can be signs of permeability. And so the word grammar is important here, because there is this overlap this continuity from grammar to grimoire. And I'm not saying these signs mean the same thing everywhere, but I'm saying they function like a language. It's a syntax for which different cultures interpret the same thing, contact with the unseen. And crucially, a sign again is not a gift. It's being marked doesn't make you powerful. It makes you answerable. And this article takes a lot of precaution to situate, responsibility, discernment, and humility as equally important as the work that you put to be in relation to spiritual experience.
Yeah, I reading through it, and noticing you kinda had, like, 10 separate categories of different
Mm,
folkloric interpretations of being touched by the other world, and I saw a through line that seemed to be that a lot of these categories were describing different circumstances, or experiences that might lead to trauma, and I'm curious how you feel
yes.
about that in general, and I'm also interested if you think someone might be able to experience a similar otherworldly experience through what the psychedelic community might call a bad trip.
Yes. Yeah, I think you're completely, you're hitting the nail on the head here, and that's not accidental that trauma appears so frequently, because I think across various traditions that contact with the other world is almost always framed as a rupture. Something breaks. The body, the psyche, or just the narrative of a normal life, whatever normal is, mundane or profane. So the person who is being marked doesn't just learn something, they are reconfigured entirely. And when I see people, for instance, envying being very touched, for instance, a part of me just want to laugh hysterically, and my severed head above my shoulder just answers, honestly, do you want to trade? Or how did you get the fairies to be interested in you, Briar? Well, I'm
Mhm.
emerging from 15 years of the beheading game, so we can trade. I'll happily trade. But that said, trauma, I don't think, is ennobling in itself. So I really don't want to romanticize that as the sole gateway to a nourishing and important relationship with the other world. Suffering doesn't automatically produce wisdom, and sometimes suffering is free and has no point, and it's just sad. What matters is whether the experience is contained and interpreted and ultimately integrated within a cultural or ritual framework that is precise and can really differ from one culture to another. So historically, various societies had ways of recognizing and supporting and shaping those moments of ruptures. We had initiations, we had elders in a given tradition, we had myths, we had ritual technologies. But without that scaffolding, I want to say that trauma is just trauma, you know? And
Mhm.
for psychedelic experience, so you talk about trips. Yes, I do think they can function similarly in principle and in structure, but not necessarily automatically in meaning. And you have to forgive me because I'm also very much a virgin when it comes to drugs. Psychedelics can violently dissolve boundaries. That much I know. We can have, and experience ego death. We can confront people with fear, with terror, with death, with the non-human through all of that. And in that sense, yes, they absolutely replicate conditions that all the traditions reach through, the same means, or, through different things like sensory deprivation or isolation or fasting or sickness or what have you. The danger, I think, is just mistaking that intensity for initiation, because a bad trip can open someone, it can also fragment them, and without preparation, without cosmology or aftercare, that risks just becoming a wound without language. And so, yeah, the overworld has that capacity. It just doesn't simply overwhelm you; it recruits you into
Yeah.
relationship, and maybe and correct me if I'm wrong, maybe, with modern psychedelic culture, we don't always have that relational ethic behind it. I've heard of people experiencing super bad trip with, various endogenous plants because they didn't approach the plant spirits the right way, because they didn't understand that there is no difference between the plant spirit, the plant components, the molecules, and the experience that you're going to have in an animistic context. This is fundamentally important to understand. There is no distinction between the body of the plant and its spirit and the voyage that you make by ingesting it. So, yeah, that relational thing aspect is so important. I'll just say it can mark somewhat, but being marked is not the same as being called. Being cold is not the same as being ready necessarily. And, in all cases, I think the work arguably begins after the rupture happened and not always during it.
Yeah. No, that makes perfect sense. Very well said.
And I hope I'm not, not coming across as a prude. That's very obvious. She
No,
never did drugs or whatever. But yeah.
no, no, not at all. Yeah, I mean, I think drugs, psychedelic drugs in particular, are a tool that can be
Mm,
really useful.
yes.
But I don't think they're in any way required. And if anything, probably if you're able to tap in more directly without them, that's just an advantage you have as a person, you know? But I think in the culture, in like quote unquote Western culture, sometimes you need something like a psychedelic drug to actually break you open enough to
Mm.
start receiving animistic perspectives.
Yes, I
Yeah.
can understand that. Something that
But I,
triggers that opening and slices you right up.
exactly, exactly. And then at that point, I find that often what we consider bad trips is not actually because the experience itself is that bad. It's because we are not prepared for what
Mm,
existing in an animistic world is like, and it's scary if you're not
yes,
prepared
yeah.
for it.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes, and arguably meeting a god or a spirit is terrifying, especially if you've never met one before. The first one is always like, wow, what is happening?
exactly.
Reality, as I understood it, is no longer true, and that's why also I think there is such a resistance to all of that in the West, if we want to phrase it like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but I really loved that piece. It was fascinating. And yeah, it's interesting. I could see how you would be fielding that question often with the people kind of following your work and stuff. Like obviously they're coming to you with an interest that's probably based on something, a hunch at least. So I liked how deep you dove into the concept. It was very cool.
But I think you have to have empathy, because once you find your tribe, you may forget
Yeah,
what it was to sort of, looking for sign, wanting to belong, and we all want to belong somewhere, and that means to be embraced, to be welcome, to be loved, and to feel like you're a part of something. We all want to be claimed by something, whether it's a god or some forces, and you have to sympathize with that. I think people are always shunned and made fun of for this very desire, but it's a shame because it's legit, it's valid. I felt that, multiple times. And whenever you try to initiate a relationship and it doesn't work, then it can feel very soul crushing. Is this spirit not wanting to enter a relationship with me? And then it's just like people, you can't be friends with everybody.
yeah, totally. Yeah, good advice. And maybe it's also you aren't quite there yet. It doesn't mean you won't
Yeah.
get there at some point. If you're really that drawn to it, it's probably for some sort of reason, but maybe you need to be opened up in a way that you haven't been, or yeah, right place, right time type thing. A certain development needs to occur or something like that.
Mm,
Yeah.
yeah, totally agree with that.
Yeah. Well, I want to take us into a Patreon segment, but before we do that, what would you like to plug for everybody?
Maybe to keep an eye out for the Holy Mountain zine. I I'm super excited to be writing alongside some super fantastic people. So yeah, big shout out to that project. And For the people who follow me on my Patreon, I have something coming up for Imbolg, a text that I hope you will like, and actually about something you and I discussed previously, Chad, about Bridget's two
Mm.
mothers, or,
Oh man.
the theory behind it, but more of a theological, very much UPG thing. So yeah,
Hmm.
I'm hoping to finish writing that and release it both in French and in English for
Cool.
Imbolg. Fingers
Ooh.
crossed.
I'm very excited for that. That's awesome. Yeah, everybody check out Briar's Patreon, and you have your Joan of Arc masterclass on the Green Chapel as well that
Mm,
people should check out. So you got all sorts of stuff. Yeah.
thank you. Thanks for the shootout.
Yeah, of course. Well, Briar, we are now behind the scenes on the Patreon podcast, and welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
So yeah, there's a few kind of additional questions I wanted to ask you related to the various articles I was reading. And you brought up Sirona earlier, and I found your description of Sirona to be incredibly potent. I have my own very personal gnosis-driven syncretism with the Irish goddess Boan and the Marian epithet of Mary, Star of the Sea. Here behind the paywall, I'd love to hear more about how Sirona might be a potential missing link describing, as you say, how Marian cults centered on crowned, star-bearing virgins, including veiled black Madonnas, echo older patterns of feminine healing, protection, and celestial intercession, as do regional legends of fairy queens and ladies of water and mountain-crying edelweiss flowers, themselves fallen stars turned plants. Sorry, I had to quote the whole thing because it was so good.
Thank you. Thank you. Um,
And you can be as
yeah,
vague as you want. I just was interested to just pull on that thread a little bit because you kind of just drop it in the article. This is the Holy Mountain article. And I was like, oh man, go on, go
yeah, I always do that. It's because,
on.
I'm somewhere with my UPG and it's not fully fleshed yet, but it's here and I
Yeah,
want to acknowledge it. So I'll
yeah.
try if you indulge me.